July 15, 1942, afternoon. Captain Charles Upham lay in the Egyptian desert sand, unable to move. His right arm shattered by a machine gun bullet that had passed through his elbow, destroying bone and tissue. His body carrying multiple wounds accumulated over 2 days of continuous fighting. His company reduced from over 100 men to 6 survivors who were now being overrun by German forces advancing across WWII Ridge. Most officers in this situation would have accepted capture as inevitable, would have stopped fighting when their wounds made fighting physically impossible, would have conserved their remaining strength for the ordeal of being a prisoner of war. Charles Upham wasn't most officers. Even as German soldiers surrounded him, even as consciousness faded from blood loss and exhaustion, he had accomplished during this battle what would earn him a second Victoria Cross, the highest military decoration in the Commonwealth, making him the only combat soldier in history to receive that honor twice. When King George VI later heard about the recommendation for Upham's second VC, the king was skeptical because no combat soldier had ever received the decoration twice, and he asked a senior officer directly, "Does he deserve it?" The Major General's response was immediate and unequivocal. "In my respectful opinion, sir, Upham won the VC several times over." Charles Hazlitt Upham was born September 21, 1908, in Christchurch, New Zealand, into a respectable middle-class family where his father John worked as a lawyer and his mother Agatha raised him with the quiet determination and understated values that characterized New Zealand culture in the early 20th century. He wasn't from a military family. There was no tradition of service that pointed him toward a career in uniform. He was just an ordinary kid from an ordinary family in a small country at the bottom of the world, where most people made their living from agriculture and where military glory seemed like something that happened elsewhere to other people. From age 9 to 16, he attended boarding schools, first WWII School in South Canterbury from 1917 to 1922, then Christ's College in Christchurch from 1923 to 1927, experiencing the kind of structured education that built character through discipline and routine, where boys learned to follow rules and accept hardship without complaint. His schoolmates remembered him as quiet and unusually determined even as a child, someone who didn't seek attention or leadership, but who would occasionally intervene when he saw injustice, particularly when bigger boys were bullying smaller ones, showing early the sense of fairness and willingness to stand against wrong that would later characterize his military service. They nicknamed him Pug because his face had an aggressive cast to it, even as a boy, a certain set to his jaw that suggested he wouldn't back down from challenges, regardless of how badly the odds were stacked against him. After completing secondary school, he attended Canterbury Agricultural College, where he earned a diploma in agriculture in 1930, then worked on large sheep farms, learning the practical skills of farm management, spending his days outside in all weather tending animals and maintaining pastures, developing the physical endurance and tolerance for discomfort that would serve him during years of combat. For a decade, Upham lived the life of a working farmer, moving between different farms as he gained experience and saved money with the eventual goal of owning his own property. Living the quiet rural existence that millions of New Zealanders lived, far from cities and farther still from the political tensions building in Europe as Nazi Germany rearmed and expanded. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, New Zealand automatically joined the war as part of the British Commonwealth, sending troops to support British forces wherever they were needed. Upham was 30 years old, established in his farming career, old enough that he could have avoided military service without shame. He enlisted anyway, joining the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force in September 1939 and training for deployment overseas. The New Zealand forces sent to fight in World War II were volunteers, men who had chosen to leave their homes and families and farms to fight a war thousands of miles away against an enemy that posed no direct threat to New Zealand itself, doing so because they believed it was right, because New Zealand's relationship with Britain created obligations that honourable men fulfilled regardless of personal cost. Upham completed officer training and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1940, assigned to a platoon that he would lead through some of the war's most brutal battles. His commanding officers recognized something in him beyond normal competence, a quality that soldiers follow even when following means walking into machine gun fire. a combination of courage and tactical intelligence and absolute refusal to quit that made him valuable beyond his rank. In March 1941, Upham's battalion shipped out to Greece as part of the Commonwealth force attempting to defend against German invasion. But the Germans overwhelmed the Greek and Commonwealth defenders through superior numbers and air power, forcing a retreat to the island of Crete, where Allied forces hoped to establish a defensive line that could be held with naval support from the Mediterranean fleet. The Battle of Crete began May 20, 1941, when German paratroopers launched the first major airborne invasion in military history, dropping thousands of elite troops onto the island to secure airfields that would allow conventional forces to land and reinforce. The fighting was immediate and savage, close-range combat between paratroopers landing directly onto defensive positions and Commonwealth troops who understood that losing Crete would give Germany control of the eastern Mediterranean. Upham's platoon was positioned near Malem airfield, one of the Germans' primary objectives, and on May 22 they received orders to attack German positions that had been fortified after the initial paratrooper landings. The attack required advancing over 3,000 yards of open ground against machine gun nests and anti-aircraft guns that the Germans had repositioned to fire at ground targets, doing so without armored support or artillery preparation, just infantry moving forward into concentrated fire. Upham led from the front, advancing ahead of his men to identify enemy positions and direct their fire, exposing himself repeatedly to locate machine gun nests so his platoon could suppress them with rifle fire while he moved close enough to destroy them with grenades. He destroyed 2 machine gun nests personally, crawling to within throwing distance while under fire, lobbing grenades into the firing positions, waiting for the explosions, then moving forward to the next position. When his platoon encountered a German anti-aircraft gun being used against ground targets, Upham approached it alone through covering fire provided by his men, got close enough to throw grenades into the gun position, destroyed the weapon and killed its crew, then returned to his platoon to continue the advance. He fought like this for 9 days, leading attacks during daylight, defending positions at night, evacuating wounded men when defensive lines collapsed, always at the front where the fighting was hardest and the casualties were highest. On May 24th, he was wounded by grenade shrapnel that tore through his shoulder, and later the same day he was shot in the foot. But he refused evacuation and continued fighting because his platoon needed experienced leadership and because leaving wounded men behind was unacceptable to him. The conditions during the Crete fighting were extraordinarily difficult even by combat standards. Food supplies were limited and irregular. Clean water was scarce. Medical supplies ran out within days. Upham contracted dysentery, the intestinal disease that causes severe diarrhea and dehydration, turning healthy men into physical wrecks within days, draining strength and weight until sufferers look like animated skeletons barely able to stand. His commanding officer later described him during the Crete fighting as looking like a skeleton because the dysentery had consumed so much of his body mass. But he kept fighting anyway, kept leading his men, kept destroying German positions despite being physically devastated by disease and wounds. On May 30th, as Commonwealth forces were retreating south toward evacuation beaches, Upham's unit was ordered to hold a position covering the withdrawal of other units. He positioned himself at the edge of a 600-foot-deep gorge, a natural defensive position that gave him clear fields of fire against advancing Germans, but also trapped him there with no escape route if he was overrun. He set up a Bren gun, a light machine gun that fired 303 British ammunition from a curved magazine holding 30 rounds, and waited for the Germans to advance. When they came, approximately 50 German soldiers moving forward to secure the gorge, Upham opened fire from his elevated position, pouring sustained bursts into the advancing troops, killing 22 Germans single-handedly before the rest retreated. This action alone would have justified a Victoria Cross, but it was just one incident in 9 days of continuous fighting where Upham led attacks, destroyed fortified positions, rescued wounded men, and held defensive lines through courage and tactical skill that his commanding officer described as outstanding leadership, tactical skill, and utter indifference to danger. When Upham was evacuated from Crete and sent to Egypt to recover, his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Howard Kippenberger, recommended him for the Victoria Cross, the highest decoration for valor in the Commonwealth. Upham's initial reaction was genuine distress because he believed the award was undeserved, that other men had fought as hard or harder, that singling him out for recognition was unfair to everyone else who had done their duty without seeking glory. Only when Kippenberger convinced him that the Victoria Cross recognized the service of the entire unit, rather than just his individual actions, was Upham able to accept the decoration without feeling like he was claiming credit he hadn't earned. This modesty wasn't false humility or performative self-deprecation. It was genuine discomfort with recognition, a deep belief that he had simply done his job and that any other officer would have done the same. After recovering from his wounds, Upham was promoted to captain and given command of a company in the New Zealand forces, fighting in the western desert of Egypt and Libya, where Commonwealth armies were battling German and Italian forces for control of North Africa and access to the Suez Canal. By July 1942, the fighting had reached El Alamein, a small railway station in Egypt where defensive lines stretched from the Mediterranean coast southward into impassable desert, creating a choke point where neither side could outflank the other, forcing a direct confrontation between armies that would determine whether the Germans could push through to Cairo and the Suez Canal, or whether Commonwealth forces could hold the line and eventually counterattack. The First Battle of El Alamein began July 1, 1942, as a series of attacks and counterattacks by both sides, attempting to break through enemy defenses, creating fluid, chaotic fighting where units became separated from their parent formations, where positions changed hands multiple times in single days, where soldiers fought surrounded battles not knowing whether relief was coming or whether they would be overrun. On July 14th, Upham's company was assigned to attack German positions on Ruwaisat Ridge, an elevated piece of ground that gave defenders clear fields of fire across the surrounding desert and made attacking infantry extremely vulnerable during their advance. Before the main assault even began, Upham had already been wounded twice that day. The first wound came when he was crossing open ground, swept by German machine gun fire, to inspect his forward sections, exposing himself to verify that defensive minefields were properly positioned and that his men had adequate fields of fire for the coming attack. The second wound came when he encountered a German truck full of soldiers and destroyed it single-handedly by running forward under fire and throwing grenades into the truck, killing everyone inside but taking shrapnel wounds in the process. Despite bleeding from both wounds, he insisted on remaining with his company for the assault because experienced leadership made the difference between successful attacks and futile charges that accomplished nothing except adding names to casualty lists. When the attack began, Upham's company formed part of the reserve battalion, positioned to exploit success or reinforce threatened positions as the battle developed, but when communications with forward units broke down and his battalion commander needed someone to go forward and report on the attack's progress, Upham volunteered personally rather than sending a subordinate, understanding that accurate first-hand information from an experienced officer was more valuable than second-hand reports from someone who might not recognize what they were seeing. He armed himself with a captured German machine gun, climbed into a jeep, and drove forward into the battle alone, navigating through German positions while under fire, using the German weapon to suppress enemy fire as he advanced. At one point during this solo reconnaissance mission, his jeep got stuck in soft sand, a common problem in desert warfare, where vehicles constantly bogged down in terrain that looked solid but collapsed under weight. Italian soldiers who were defending nearby positions came over and helped push Upham's jeep out of the sand, apparently not recognizing him as an enemy, or perhaps just responding automatically to help someone in distress. One of those bizarre moments of humanity that occurred occasionally even in the middle of combat. Upham thanked them and drove on, completed his reconnaissance, and returned to his battalion with the information his commander needed to commit reserves effectively. During the main assault, Upham's company came under fire from 4 German machine gun nests and several tanks positioned to rake the attacking infantry with concentrated fire. Upham personally destroyed at least 1 German tank using grenades, approaching close enough to throw them onto the tank's thin top armor, where they penetrated and detonated inside, and he eliminated multiple machine gun positions through similar close assaults, leading his men forward while under fire, destroying positions that were slaughtering the attacking infantry. During one of these attacks, he was shot through the elbow, the bullet shattering his arm and rendering it useless, but he continued fighting anyway, Unable to hold a rifle with both hands, but still capable of throwing grenades and directing his men's fire. The fighting continued through July 14th into July 15th, a sustained battle lasting more than 24 hours, during which Upham commanded his company, despite wounds that would have justified evacuation, despite blood loss that made him weak and dizzy, despite pain that other men would have found unbearable. He led a bayonet charge at one point, fixing bayonets to rifles and advancing directly into German positions in the most primitive form of infantry combat, closing to hand-to-hand fighting range, doing so with a broken arm that prevented him from wielding his rifle properly. Eventually, blood loss and exhaustion overwhelmed even his determination, and he collapsed, unable to move, lying in the sand while German forces overran the position and captured him along with the 6 other survivors from his company. The Germans recognized they had captured someone significant, an officer who had fought with extraordinary courage despite being wounded multiple times, who had personally destroyed multiple vehicles and fortified positions, who had led his men until physically unable to continue. When the battle ended and Upham was evacuated to a prisoner of war camp, Italian doctors examining his shattered arm recommended amputation to prevent gangrene because they had no medication to fight infection in such a severe wound. But Upham refused, knowing that amputation without anesthesia often resulted in death from shock and infection, preferring to risk losing his arm to gangrene rather than submitting to an operation that would probably kill him. A fellow prisoner who was also a doctor eventually managed to treat the wound and prevent infection, saving Upham's arm through improvised medical care using whatever limited supplies were available in the prison camp. Upham's actions at El Alamein earned him a bar to his Victoria Cross, meaning he had been awarded the Victoria Cross a second time, a distinction held by only 2 other men in British military history and never before by a combat soldier. When King George VI was informed that Upham was being recommended for a second VC, the king was skeptical, questioning whether anyone could deserve the Commonwealth's highest military decoration twice, wondering whether this was some administrative error or exaggeration. He asked a senior officer directly, "Does he deserve it?" The Major General who had reviewed Upham's record responded immediately, "In my respectful opinion, sir, Upham won the VC several times over, meaning that any one of Upham's individual actions at El Alamein would have justified the Victoria Cross, and that taken together his performance had exceeded what the decoration was meant to recognize. 3 men in history have received the Victoria Cross twice. The other 2 were medical officers. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Martin Leake, who received his first VC during the Boer War for rescuing wounded under fire, and his second during World War I for similar actions, and Captain Noel Chavas, who received both his VCs during World War I for rescuing wounded soldiers and was killed shortly after earning his second decoration. Both were extraordinarily brave men who had risked their lives repeatedly to save others, but neither had been combat soldiers in the sense of leading attacks against enemy positions. Upham was different. He was an infantry officer who led from the front, who destroyed enemy fortifications, who killed enemy soldiers, who commanded troops in the most dangerous fighting of the war. His double VC recognized not medical courage in saving lives, but combat courage in taking lives, which made his achievement unique in military history. Upham spent the next 3 years as a prisoner of war, first in Italian camps and later in German camps after Italy surrendered in 1943 and German forces took over guarding Allied prisoners. He proved to be exactly the kind of prisoner that guards hated and that other prisoners admired, completely unwilling to accept captivity as permanent, constantly planning and attempting escapes, inspiring other prisoners to maintain hope and resistance. On one attempt, he tried to escape in broad daylight, running straight at the perimeter fence in hopes of getting over it before guards could react. But he got tangled in the barbed wire and was hanging there when a German guard confronted him. Instead of panicking or trying to fight, Upham calmly pulled out a cigarette and lit it, smoking while entangled in wire, displaying the kind of composed courage under absurd circumstances that became part of his legend among both prisoners and guards. His multiple escape attempts eventually resulted in his transfer to Colditz Castle in Germany, the maximum security prison where the Germans sent Allied officers who had demonstrated they couldn't be trusted not to attempt escape. Colditz was considered escape-proof, a medieval castle converted into a prison with multiple layers of security, guards who had been specifically trained to prevent escapes, and a location deep inside Germany where even successful escapees would face hundreds of miles of hostile territory before reaching neutral countries. Upham was sent there in 1944 and remained imprisoned until April 1945, when American forces liberated the castle as Germany collapsed. The approval for Upham's bar to the Victoria Cross came through on September 26, 1945, months after the war in Europe had ended. After Upham had been released from Colditz and was preparing to return to New Zealand, he received the decoration at Buckingham Palace from King George VI, the same king who had initially been skeptical about whether Upham deserved a second VC. The ceremony was formal and dignified, acknowledging Upham's extraordinary service, but for Upham the real honor was getting to go home, getting to return to the farm and the quiet life he had left 6 years earlier when he enlisted. He returned to New Zealand and resumed farming, settling in Canterbury with his wife Rosamond, whom he had married during the war. Raising 2 daughters, living the ordinary life of a rural farmer in a small country where most people didn't seek fame or attention, and where veterans generally didn't discuss their war service. The New Zealand government and local community raised $10,000 to buy him a farm in recognition of his service, an extraordinary gesture that reflected national gratitude, but that Upham accepted with characteristic modesty, treating it as the opportunity to farm rather than as a reward for heroism. He rejected publicity, turned down interviews, refused offers to write his memoirs or profit from his war record, living quietly until his death on November 22, 1994, at age 86. When Upham died, over 5,000 people lined the streets of Christchurch for his funeral, a massive turnout in a city whose entire population was only a few hundred thousand, demonstrating how deeply New Zealanders valued his service and his character. The funeral at Christchurch Cathedral was conducted with full military honours, and he was buried in the graveyard of St. Paul's Church in Papanui, a simple grave marking the resting place of an extraordinary man who had spent most of his life trying to be ordinary. A memorial service was also held at St. Martin-in-the-Fields Church in London, attended by representatives of the royal family, senior government officials from New Zealand and Britain, military leaders, and other Victoria Cross and George Cross holders, acknowledging that Upham's service belonged not just to New Zealand, but to the broader Commonwealth whose values he had defended. In 2006, Upham's Victoria Cross and bar were sold by his daughters to the Imperial War Museum for an undisclosed sum, though the New Zealand government had quoted approximately $3.3 million as the price they would have paid to keep the medals in New Zealand. The sale generated controversy because many New Zealanders believed the medals should remain in the country. But New Zealand law prohibited exporting historic items, so the Imperial War Museum agreed to loan the medals permanently to the National Army Museum in New Zealand, ensuring they would be displayed where New Zealanders could see them while technically remaining in the Imperial War Museum's collection. The story of Charles Upham raises questions about the nature of courage and the relationship between heroism and humility. He accomplished things that would have made most men proud for the rest of their lives, receiving decorations that represented the highest recognition his country and the Commonwealth could offer. Yet he remained fundamentally uncomfortable with attention and praise, consistently deflecting credit to his men and expressing genuine belief that he had simply done his duty. When first informed of his Victoria Cross, his response was, "It's meant for the men," meaning he saw the decoration as recognition of his platoon's service rather than his individual actions. This wasn't performance. This was genuine modesty born from understanding that military success depends on entire units working together, that officers who receive decorations do so partly because they're in positions where their actions are noticed and documented, while enlisted men often do equally brave things without recognition. Upham's combat record demonstrates certain consistent patterns that help explain why he was so effective as an officer and why he survived battles that killed most of his men. He led from the front, going first into dangerous situations rather than sending subordinates ahead, which earned absolute loyalty from his men because they knew he would never ask them to do anything he wasn't willing to do himself. He focused on destroying enemy positions methodically rather than seeking glory through dramatic gestures, approaching machine gun nests through covered routes when possible, using grenades effectively, coordinating his platoon's fire to suppress enemies while he maneuvered. He refused to accept limitations, continuing to fight when wounded, finding ways to accomplish missions even when circumstances seemed impossible, displaying the kind of stubborn determination that turns desperate situations into victories. But he also benefited from exceptional luck in surviving wounds that killed other men. The grenade shrapnel that hit his shoulder in Crete missed his spine and major blood vessels by inches. The bullet that shattered his arm at El Alamein could have severed his brachial artery and caused him to bleed out in minutes. The machine gun fire that swept across positions he occupied killed men standing next to him while leaving him untouched. Military historians studying his service have noted that Upham's survival required both skill and fortune, that while he maximized his chances through tactical intelligence and leadership ability, he also needed luck to survive 9 days of fighting in Crete and 2 days at El Alamein. The contrast between Upham's wartime achievements and his post-war modesty created tension between his public reputation and his private life. New Zealand celebrated him as a national hero, the country's most decorated soldier, living proof that New Zealanders could fight and win against the world's best armies. Upham wanted none of that attention, wanted to be left alone to farm and raise his family, wanted his wartime service to remain in the past where it belonged. He gave interviews reluctantly when pressed by researchers or journalists, usually deflecting questions about his own actions to discuss other men who had served with him, maintaining to the end that he had been one soldier among thousands and that his decorations represented collective achievement rather than individual glory. This resistance to being treated as a hero made him more respected in New Zealand culture, which values humility and dislikes boastfulness, which admires achievement but suspects people who draw attention to their accomplishments. Upham embodied the New Zealand ideal of the quiet achiever, the person who does extraordinary things without seeking recognition, who serves when needed, then returns to ordinary life without demanding special treatment. His unwillingness to profit from his war record or trade on his decorations reinforced this image, demonstrating that his service had been motivated by duty rather than seeking glory or advantage. The broader historical significance of Upham's service includes his role in demonstrating that Commonwealth forces could fight effectively against German troops who had been portrayed as invincible after their victories in Poland and France. The Battle of Crete was ultimately a German victory, but the fierce resistance Commonwealth troops mounted, exemplified by soldiers like Upham, imposed such heavy casualties on German paratroopers that Hitler never again authorized a major airborne operation. The fighting at El Alamein was crucial in stopping German advances toward the Suez Canal and setting conditions for Montgomery's later victory that drove Axis forces out of Egypt. Upham's individual contribution to these battles was significant but not decisive in strategic terms. Wars are won by divisions and armies, not by individual soldiers, however brave. But his example of courage and leadership helped other men fight more effectively, inspired units to maintain cohesion under stress, demonstrated that determination and tactical skill could overcome superior numbers and firepower. The question of whether Upham was the best soldier of World War II is ultimately unanswerable because military effectiveness can't be measured objectively across different contexts and roles. Fighter pilots, submarine commanders, tank aces, infantry officers, and medics all contributed in ways that can't be directly compared. What can be said definitively is that among Commonwealth infantry officers who led platoons and companies in direct combat against German forces, Upham stands out for the combination of courage, tactical intelligence, leadership ability, and sustained performance over multiple campaigns that earned him recognition no other combat soldier has achieved. His double Victoria Cross doesn't mean he was twice as brave as other VC recipients. It means that on 2 separate occasions, more than a year apart, in different theaters against different enemies, he performed with such exceptional courage and effectiveness that senior officers who had seen thousands of brave actions believed his performance exceeded normal standards for the Victoria Cross. Charles Upham's legacy extends beyond his military decorations to include the example he set for how to bear recognition without letting it define your entire life. He understood that his wartime service was important but temporary, that the decorations he received acknowledged past actions, but didn't obligate him to live as a professional hero, that the most important thing after the war was returning to productive civilian life and contributing to his community through ordinary work, rather than trading on past achievements. This understanding allowed him to have a full life after the war, rather than becoming trapped in his military identity, raising a family and managing a farm and participating in his local community as a farmer, rather than as a decorated veteran. When Upham died in 1994, New Zealand lost not just a war hero, but a living example of a particular kind of character that New Zealand culture valued. Competent without being boastful, courageous without seeking recognition, willing to serve when needed, but equally willing to return to ordinary life when service ended. Modest about achievements while taking pride in having done duty properly. The massive turnout for his funeral demonstrated that New Zealanders understood what they were losing, that Upham represented something important about national character and values that transcended his individual military achievements. The thousands of people who lined the streets weren't just honoring a decorated soldier. They were honoring an ideal of how to live with courage and humility, how to serve without seeking reward, how to achieve greatness while remaining fundamentally ordinary. Charles Upham earned the Victoria Cross twice for actions that any one of which would have justified the decoration. He fought through wounds and disease that would have incapacitated other men. He led from the front when leading from the front meant accepting the highest risk. He escaped repeatedly from prisoner of war camps, despite knowing recapture would result in punishment. He returned to farming after the war and lived quietly for nearly 50 years, refusing to profit from his service. When informed of his first Victoria Cross, his response was, "It's meant for the men." When asked if he deserved his second Victoria Cross, the Major General's response was, "Upham won the VC several times over. He remains the only combat soldier in history to receive the Victoria Cross twice, a distinction that acknowledges extraordinary service while reminding us that the most remarkable people often work hardest to remain unremarkable." The detailed chronology of Upham's actions in Crete reveals the sustained nature of his courage over the 9 days of fighting from May 22nd to May 30th, 1941. Each day brought new challenges that required immediate tactical decisions under fire, and Upham's consistent response was to move toward danger rather than away from it, to lead from the front rather than directing from safer positions, to accept personal risk as the price of effective leadership. On May 22nd, the first day of the attack on Malem, his platoon advanced 3,000 yards through German defensive positions that should have been impenetrable to unsupported infantry. Yet Upham found routes through the defenses, identified weaknesses in German positions, and destroyed fortifications systematically until his platoon had penetrated further than anyone thought possible. On May 23rd and 24, as German reinforcements landed and counterattacked, Upham's platoon defended positions they had captured, fighting off multiple German assaults while taking casualties that reduced his effective strength daily. He evacuated wounded men personally when stretcher-bearers couldn't reach forward positions, carrying injured soldiers on his back while under fire, exposing himself to save men who would have died if left where they fell. The grenade shrapnel wound he received on May 24th tore through his shoulder muscle, limiting his arm mobility and causing constant pain. But he refused medical evacuation because leaving would mean abandoning his men, and because his experience and knowledge of the terrain made him more effective than any replacement officer who might be sent forward. The dysentery that afflicted him during the Crete campaign was more than uncomfortable illness. It was a debilitating condition that drained his body of fluids and nutrients, caused constant intestinal cramping, left him weakened to the point where simple physical tasks became exhausting. His commanding officer's description of him looking like a skeleton wasn't exaggeration. Photographs taken after the Crete evacuation show a gaunt, hollow-eyed man who had lost probably 30 pounds in 9 days, whose uniform hung loose on a frame that had been robust before the battle. Yet even while suffering from dysentery, he continued leading attacks, destroying German positions, making tactical decisions that kept his platoon combat effective when other units were falling apart under the sustained stress of continuous fighting. The action on May 30th at the Gorge, where Upham killed 22 Germans with his Bren gun, demonstrated both his tactical intelligence and his willingness to accept isolated positions that other officers would have rejected as too dangerous. He recognized that the gorge provided a natural choke point where German forces advancing toward evacuation beaches would have to pass. That positioning himself at the rim gave him commanding fields of fire that multiplied his effectiveness, that holding that position even briefly would delay German pursuit and save Commonwealth lives. He also understood that if German forces flanked the position, he would be trapped with no escape route, that he was committing himself to fight to the death if necessary. He chose the position anyway because the tactical advantages outweighed personal risk. Upham's time as a prisoner of war from July 1942 until April 1945 revealed different aspects of his character than combat had shown, demonstrating that his courage wasn't limited to battlefield situations, but extended to the grinding resistance required for long-term captivity. His first escape attempt came within weeks of being captured, before his wounds had fully healed, involving an attempt to cut through wire fencing at night and walk to Allied lines, despite having no maps, no supplies, and only vague knowledge of where Allied forces might be located. He was recaptured within hours, but the attempt established his reputation among both prisoners and guards as someone who wouldn't accept captivity passively. Another escape attempt involved tunneling, the classic prisoner of war technique where inmates dig underneath fences and walls, hoping to emerge outside the camp perimeter. Upham participated in digging a tunnel that took months to complete, working in shifts with other prisoners, disposing of excavated dirt secretly, shoring up tunnel walls with scrounged materials, all while avoiding detection by guards who conducted regular searches. The tunnel was discovered days before completion when guards noticed subsidence in the ground above it, ending the escape attempt and resulting in punishment for everyone involved. But Upham immediately began planning the next attempt because giving up wasn't in his nature. The broad daylight escape attempt that ended with him tangled in barbed wire and smoking a cigarette demonstrated both his willingness to try tactics that had minimal chance of success and his ability to maintain composure in absurd situations. He had been watching guard patterns and believed he had identified a brief window when he might reach the fence, climb over it, and get far enough away before guards could react. The plan failed when he got caught in the wire, leaving him hanging there completely helpless. But instead of panicking, he pulled out a cigarette and lit it, turning the humiliating situation into a demonstration of unshakable calm that impressed even the German guards who had to cut him free. The incident became legendary among prisoners and contributed to his eventual transfer to Colditz, when German authorities decided he was too dangerous and too influential to keep in a regular POW camp. Colditz Castle presented different challenges than standard camps because it was specifically designed to prevent escapes, with multiple redundant security measures, guards who had been trained to think like potential escapees, and a location deep in Germany that made successful escape merely the first step in a much longer journey to safety. Upham studied the castle's defenses systematically, looking for weaknesses, developing relationships with other prisoners who had attempted escapes, gathering information about guard routines and security procedures. He attempted at least one escape from Colditz before liberation, though records of this attempt are incomplete, and Upham never discussed it in detail after the war, maintaining the soldiers' tradition of not revealing escape techniques that might compromise future prisoners. His liberation from Colditz in April 1945 came when American forces advancing through Germany reached the castle and found hundreds of Allied prisoners, including numerous senior officers who had been held for years. Upham had been imprisoned for nearly 3 years at that point, from July 1942 until April 1945, spending his late 30s in captivity rather than returning to his farm and his wife. But he emerged mentally intact and ready to resume civilian life, refusing to let the prison years define him or damage his fundamental character. The approval and award of his bar to the Victoria Cross raised questions about whether anyone could objectively deserve the decoration twice, whether there was some qualitative difference between actions that warranted 1 VC versus 2. Military historians examining Upham's record have noted that his first Victoria Cross for Crete covered 9 days of sustained action that included multiple individual incidents, any one of which might have justified the decoration: destroying machine gun nests, eliminating an anti-aircraft gun, evacuating wounded men under fire, killing 22 Germans single-handedly, continuing to fight despite wounds and severe dysentery. His second VC for El Alamein covered 2 days, but similarly included multiple individual actions that exceeded normal standards, destroying a truck full of Germans with grenades, conducting solo reconnaissance through enemy lines, destroying a tank, eliminating machine gun nests, fighting with a broken arm, leading a bayonet charge while seriously wounded. The decision to award him a bar to his VC wasn't based on some arithmetic where his actions at El Alamein were quantitatively greater than his actions in Crete, but rather on recognition that he had performed at an exceptional level in 2 completely separate campaigns more than a year apart, that his courage and effectiveness weren't momentary responses to immediate crisis, but sustained characteristics that defined how he fought regardless of circumstances. The bar acknowledged that receiving the Victoria Cross hadn't satisfied whatever drove him to lead from the front and accept extreme risk, that he continued performing at the same exceptional level even after being recognized for doing so, that his service at El Alamein demonstrated the same qualities that earned the first decoration, but in a different context against different enemies. The significance of Upham's decorations for New Zealand national identity cannot be overstated because they came at a time when New Zealand was actively defining itself as a nation distinct from Britain while maintaining Commonwealth ties, seeking to establish that New Zealanders could achieve excellence in fields dominated by larger countries, proving that a small population could produce individuals who excelled at the highest levels. New Zealand's total population in 1941 was approximately 1.6 million people, smaller than many cities, yet the country produced a soldier who earned the Victoria Cross twice, something no British officer or soldier had achieved, demonstrating that national character and individual courage mattered more than population size or economic resources. The fact that Upham came from a farming background rather than military tradition reinforced the New Zealand self-image of capable citizens who could master any challenge through determination and practical intelligence, who didn't need specialized training or aristocratic background to excel in demanding professions, who succeeded through competence and courage rather than credentials and connections. His modesty and refusal to profit from his decorations aligned perfectly with New Zealand cultural values that emphasized humility and collective achievement over individual glory, making him a hero who embodied what New Zealanders wanted to believe about themselves. Upham's post-war interviews, though rare, revealed his thinking about combat and leadership in ways that help explain his effectiveness. In one interview conducted decades after the war, he described his approach to leading attacks as focusing on destroying enemy weapons rather than killing enemy soldiers, recognizing that a destroyed machine gun stopped being a threat permanently while wounded or frightened soldiers might recover and resume fighting. This practical focus on tactical objectives rather than body counts reflected a mature understanding of combat effectiveness, where the goal was accomplishing the mission rather than maximizing casualties. When asked about fear, he acknowledged feeling it constantly during combat, but said that accepting fear as a normal response allowed him to function despite it, that pretending to be fearless would have been stupid and counterproductive, that managing fear rather than denying it was essential to making good tactical decisions under stress. This honesty about emotional responses during combat contrasted with Hollywood portrayals of fearless heroes who never experienced doubt or terror, presenting a more realistic picture of courage as acting appropriately despite fear rather than feeling no fear at all. His description of his relationship with the men he commanded emphasized mutual respect rather than authority, explaining that soldiers followed officers who demonstrated competence and courage, who didn't ask subordinates to do anything the officer wasn't willing to do, who made tactical decisions that minimized unnecessary casualties while accomplishing objectives. He believed that military rank provided authority, but that genuine leadership came from earning trust through consistent performance, that decorations and promotions meant nothing to soldiers unless the officer had proven himself in combat, where mistakes killed people and competence saved lives. Upham's marriage to Rosamund Denny in 1941, during a brief leave between campaigns, provided stability and emotional support that helped him endure 3 years of captivity, knowing he had someone waiting for his return. She visited him once while he was imprisoned, a difficult and emotional meeting conducted under guard supervision where they could barely speak freely. But the visit confirmed their commitment to each other and gave Upham motivation to survive captivity and escape attempts that might have killed him. After the war, they raised 2 daughters together, maintaining a private family life that deliberately excluded Upham's military service from daily conversation, allowing their daughters to grow up knowing their father primarily as a farmer rather than as a decorated war hero. The comparison between Upham and other highly decorated soldiers of World War II reveals both commonalities and unique characteristics. Audie Murphy, America's most decorated soldier, earned the Medal of Honor and numerous other decorations through aggressive offensive action against German forces in Europe, displaying courage and tactical skill comparable to Upham's. But Murphy struggled with post-traumatic stress and never achieved the quiet satisfaction with civilian life that Upham found in farming. Douglas Bader, the British fighter pilot who flew despite having prosthetic legs, demonstrated similar refusal to accept limitations and similar aggressive approach to combat. But Bader sought publicity and recognition in ways Upham avoided. The Soviet sniper Lyudmila Pavlichenko earned acclaim through technical excellence and sustained performance. But her post-war role as a propaganda symbol contrasted sharply with Upham's rejection of public attention. What distinguished Upham wasn't necessarily greater courage or more impressive individual actions than these other highly decorated soldiers, but rather the combination of sustained, exceptional performance across multiple campaigns, recognition through the Commonwealth's highest decoration awarded twice, and subsequent choice to live quietly without exploiting his military fame for personal advantage. This combination made him unique not just in military terms, but in broader cultural terms as an example of how to achieve greatness while remaining fundamentally ordinary, how to serve extraordinarily while maintaining humility, how to earn recognition while refusing to let it define your entire life. The technical aspects of Upham's combat effectiveness included skills and knowledge that aren't always visible in medal citations, but that made the difference between surviving combat and becoming a casualty. He understood terrain and how to use it, positioning himself and his men to maximize fields of fire while minimizing exposure to enemy fire, selecting routes that provided cover during advances, identifying defensive positions that were difficult for enemies to flank. He understood weapons and their limitations, knowing the effective range of rifles and machine guns, understanding how grenades behaved when thrown at different angles, recognizing that destroying enemy weapons was often more important than killing enemy soldiers. He understood small unit tactics and how to coordinate platoon-level operations, using rifle fire to suppress enemies while assault teams maneuvered into grenade range, timing attacks to exploit enemy weaknesses, maintaining unit cohesion during retreats when soldiers were most vulnerable to panic and disorganization. These technical skills weren't innate talents, but learned capabilities developed through training and combat experience, refined through constant practice, and adjusted based on what worked and what got people killed. The fact that Upham survived multiple campaigns while many equally brave officers were killed demonstrated that courage alone wasn't sufficient. Effective combat leadership required combining courage with tactical intelligence and technical competence. His death in 1994 at age 86 meant he lived nearly 50 years after the war, 5 times longer than the period of his military service, allowing him to have a complete life that extended far beyond his combat achievements. He saw his daughters grow up and have families of their own, experienced the satisfactions and frustrations of farming through good years and bad, participated in his local community as a neighbor and citizen rather than as a celebrity, maintained friendships with other veterans who understood what combat had been like without needing to discuss it constantly. The fact that he died at home surrounded by family rather than in a veterans' hospital or alone represented a kind of victory, proving that war service didn't have to destroy the possibility of normal, happy life afterward, that even soldiers who had seen the worst of combat could return to peace and build meaningful civilian lives. Charles Upham's story endures not because he was perfect or because his achievements exceeded human possibility, but because he demonstrated that ordinary people from small countries can accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demand it, that courage and leadership don't require aristocratic background or military tradition, that the most remarkable people often work hardest to remain unremarkable. When he said it's meant for the men after receiving his first Victoria Cross, he was expressing genuine belief that his decorations recognized collective achievement rather than individual glory. When the Major General said Upham won the VC several times over, he was confirming what everyone who served with Upham already knew, that this quiet farmer from New Zealand had performed at a level that exceeded the highest standards of courage and effectiveness, not once but repeatedly, across multiple campaigns, establishing a record of sustained exceptional service that remains unmatched by any combat soldier in Commonwealth military history.